There exists a name that once commanded reverence in ancient temples, whispered in prayers by the sick seeking healing, invoked by kings desperate for divine guidance. That same name would eventually become synonymous with corruption itself, spoken only in exorcisms and accusations of the darkest betrayals. This is the paradox of Beelzebub, a figure whose journey from venerated deity to prince of hell reveals something profound about how civilizations weaponize the sacred symbols of their enemies. Stand in the ruins of ancient Ekron, a Philistine city where merchants once haggled over purple-dyed cloth and farmers brought offerings to their patron god. Here, in approximately 850 BCE, people worshipped Baal-Zebub, a deity whose name scholars now believe meant Lord of the High Place, or Lord of the Exalted Dwelling. Yet, when Hebrew scribes recorded this deity in their texts, they performed a linguistic assassination. They transformed Baal-Zebub into Baal-Zebub, changing one subtle vowel to create an entirely different meaning. Lord of Flies. This wasn't mere translation. It was theological warfare conducted through etymology, turning a god of healing into a lord of pestilence and decay. But the true transformation hadn't yet begun. Over centuries, this mocked deity would evolve into something far more terrifying than the Philistines ever imagined. He would become Beelzebub, second only to Satan himself in the infernal hierarchy, commander of legions, and the embodiment of humanity's most insatiable sin. His story is one of religious conflict, medieval demonology, literary genius, and psychological insight. It's a narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about consumption, corruption, and the nature of evil itself. The tale begins with desperation. King Ahaziah of Israel, son of the infamous Ahab and Jezebel, had fallen through the latticed window of his upper chamber in Samaria. The injury was severe, potentially fatal, and in his pain and fear, the king made a choice that would echo through millennia. He sent messengers to consult Baal-Zebub, the god of Ekron, asking whether he would recover. This decision represented more than seeking a second medical opinion. For an Israelite king to bypass Yahweh and consult a Philistine deity was spiritual treason of the highest order. The prophet Elijah intercepted these messengers with a message that dripped with contempt. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-Zebub, the god of Ekron? The Hebrew text preserves this moment of theological confrontation, where Elijah's question wasn't merely rhetorical, but accusatory. The king's choice to seek wisdom from flies rather than the divine was seen as the ultimate apostasy. What the biblical authors may not have fully understood, or deliberately obscured, was the original nature of Baal-Zebub's worship. Archaeological evidence suggests this deity functioned as an oracle, a source of prophecy and healing in Philistine culture. The Zebub component likely derived from Zebul, meaning prince or exalted one. The Philistines weren't venerating insects, they were honoring a celestial lord. But to the monotheistic Hebrews fighting for religious survival among polytheistic neighbors, such nuance was dangerous. Every competing deity needed to be degraded, mocked, associated with filth and corruption. The wordplay was deliberate and devastating. Flies in ancient Near Eastern culture represented everything antithetical to the sacred. They swarmed on corpses, spread disease, emerged from dung heaps. They were creatures of unclean spaces, of decay and putrefaction. By transforming Baal-Zebub into the Lord of Flies, Hebrew scribes weren't just renaming a foreign god, they were redefining him as the patron of corruption itself. This linguistic manipulation would prove far more enduring than any military conquest. Yet, even in this mockery, there remained a seed of the original power. The Zoroastrian tradition preserved in their demonology a figure called Nasu, a female demon of decay and impurity, who manifested as a grotesque fly. Dogs and birds could drive Nasu away with a single glance, but her association with flies and putrefaction paralleled what was happening to Baal-Zebub's reputation. The fly became not just a symbol of filth, but of supernatural corruption, of divine power inverted and perverted. Centuries after Ahaziah's fall, a pseudepigraphal text emerged that would fundamentally reshape Beelzebub's identity. The Testament of Solomon, likely composed between the 1st and 5th centuries CE, presented a narrative so compelling it influenced demonological thought for over a millennium. In this account, King Solomon possessed a magical ring given by the archangel Michael, inscribed with the name that brings all demons into subjection. The story begins with a demon named Orneus tormenting a young man favored by Solomon, stealing half his wages and draining his vitality through his right thumb. Solomon commanded the youth to throw the ring at Orneus, stamping him with its seal. Then came the crucial moment. Solomon ordered the now bound Orneus to take the ring and imprint the prince of demons, Beelzebub. Notice the spelling. Not Beelzebub, but Beelzebul. Some scholars argue this represents a different entity entirely, perhaps derived from Baal-Zebub, preserving the original Lord of the High Place meaning. Others see it as simply variant spelling of the same figure. What matters is what Beelzebul revealed when brought before Solomon. "I am the ruler of all demons," Beelzebul declared, establishing his position at the apex of the infernal hierarchy. But his most startling claim came next. He identified himself as a former leading heavenly angel associated with the star Hesperus, the Greek name for Venus as the evening star. This association wasn't arbitrary. In Latin tradition, Hesperus as the morning star was called Lucifer, light-bearer. The testament seemed to be suggesting that Beelzebul and Lucifer were one and the same, or at least that Beelzebul held comparable rank before his fall. What kind of destruction did this prince of demons cause? Beelzebul provided a chilling catalog. He destroyed through tyrants, caused demons to be worshipped as gods, excited priests to lust, incited jealousies in cities leading to murders, and brought about war. These weren't the random torments of a lesser demon, but the systematic corruptions of a strategic mind working on civilizational scales. He didn't merely tempt individuals, he poisoned entire societies. Solomon commanded Beelzebul to explain the nature of demons and to provide unclean spirits for the temple's construction. But he also learned something crucial. Beelzebul claimed he could be thwarted by the Almighty God and would vanish if anyone invoked the name Emmanuel or used the oath Eloi, the cry Jesus would later utter on the cross. This detail, clearly a Christian interpolation into the Jewish text, demonstrated how Beelzebub was being woven into an emerging Christian demonology that would define him for centuries to come. Fast forward to 1st century Palestine, where a controversy erupted that would cement Beelzebub's role in Christian theology. Jesus had just healed a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, restoring both his sight and speech. The crowd, amazed, began wondering if this could be the Messiah. But the Pharisees, threatened by Jesus' growing influence, offered a different explanation. It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons. This accusation was strategically brilliant and theologically devastating. By claiming Jesus used Beelzebub's authority to cast out demons, the Pharisees weren't merely questioning his power. They were accusing him of being in league with the ultimate evil. The name they chose was deliberate. Beelzebub had evolved from a mocked Philistine deity into the recognized prince of demons, in Jewish tradition, a figure second only to Satan himself in malevolent authority. Jesus' response revealed the logical absurdity of the accusation. If Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? This wasn't just rhetorical flourish, but a profound statement about the nature of evil and power. A divided kingdom cannot stand. A house at war with itself collapses. The very consistency and persistence of demonic influence suggested a unified opposition to divine order, not internal chaos. This exchange in Matthew's Gospel, paralleled in Mark and Luke, did something crucial for Beelzebub's evolution. It firmly established him in Christian consciousness as not merely a demon, but the prince of demons, the commander of infernal forces. The Pharisees' accusation, intended to discredit Jesus, instead elevated Beelzebub to a position of terrible prominence in Christian demonology. He became the adversary's second in command, the administrator of hell's bureaucracy. The theological implications rippled outward. If Beelzebub commanded demons, if he organized and directed their activities, then hell possessed structure, hierarchy, and strategic purpose. This wasn't a chaotic realm of random torment, but an organized opposition to divine will. Beelzebub represented the systematization of evil, the bureaucratization of corruption. As Christianity spread through Europe and demonology became a serious theological discipline, scholars faced a problem. Which deadly sin did Beelzebub embody? The answer, confusingly, depended on which authority you consulted and when. The earliest systematic pairing appeared around 1409 in The Lantern of Light, an anonymous English Lollard tract often attributed to John Wycliffe. This text introduced the concept of matching the 7 deadly sins with individual demons who specialized in tempting humanity toward each vice. In this original schema, Beelzebub represented envy. Lordeth our envious. In the Middle English text, the choice made thematic sense. Envy corrupts from within, eating away at the soul like flies consuming a carcass. The envious person resents others' blessings, feels diminished by their neighbor's success, and ultimately wishes for their downfall. But by the early 17th century, the French inquisitor, Sébastien Michaelis, offered a different association in his Admirable History of 1612. Michaelis classified demons into 3 hierarchical levels based on their former angelic rank. He placed Beelzebub at the first and highest level as the former prince of the seraphim, second only to Lucifer himself. More significantly, Michaelis wrote that Beelzebub tempts men with pride rather than envy. This shift reflected theological sophistication. Pride, the first and greatest sin, the very sin that caused Lucifer's fall, seemed more appropriate for hell's second in command. Then came Peter Binsfeld's classification in 1589, published in his Treatise on Confessions by Evildoers and Witches. Binsfeld, a German bishop and fervent witch hunter behind the horrific Trier witch trials, created what would become the most enduring schema. In his system, Beelzebub embodied gluttony. This assignment seemed almost counterintuitive at first. Surely the Lord of Flies deserved a more obviously sinister sin than mere overeating. But Binsfeld understood something profound about gluttony that transcended simple overconsumption. Gluttony wasn't just eating too much. It represented insatiable appetite, the inability to be satisfied, the compulsion to consume beyond reason or need. And what better symbol for this than flies? Flies consume everything. They swarm on food, on waste, on corpses, indiscriminate in their appetite. They represent consumption without purpose, feeding without nourishment, desire without satisfaction. The medieval understanding of gluttony extended beyond physical hunger to encompass spiritual emptiness. The glutton sought to fill an internal void through external consumption, but the void only grew larger. This resonated with Beelzebub's nature as Lord of Flies. Just as flies endlessly consume yet never find satisfaction, the glutton's appetite only intensifies with feeding. The more one has, the more one wants. The feast becomes a torment of perpetual craving. Binsfeld's classification also aligned Beelzebub with broader medieval anxieties about excess and appetite. The late 16th century witnessed growing inequality, conspicuous consumption by the wealthy while peasants starved, and the beginning of global trade that brought exotic luxuries to European markets. Gluttony became not just a personal sin, but a social commentary on an emerging consumer culture that valued accumulation over sufficiency. Moreover, the connection to flies added a layer of theological irony. Gluttony was often depicted as a sin of the beast, the reduction of human dignity to animal appetite. Flies, as the lowest and most despised of creatures, perfectly embodied this degradation. To be ruled by Beelzebub was to descend from the divine image to the level of insects mindlessly consuming whatever lay before them. When John Milton sat down to write Paradise Lost in the 1660s, he inherited centuries of demonological tradition. But Milton was a poet of genius, and he transformed the conventional figure of Beelzebub into something psychologically complex and politically astute. In Book 1 of the epic, Satan and Beelzebub awaken in the burning lake of hell after their catastrophic defeat. Satan speaks first, his words defiant and grandiose, refusing to accept submission even in defeat. But Beelzebub's response reveals a different temperament. Where Satan burns with rebellious pride, Beelzebub displays strategic calculation. Milton wrote that, "Than whom Satan except, none higher sat, establishing Beelzebub's position explicitly as second-in-command. Yet, this second-in-command role wasn't merely ceremonial. Beelzebub functions as Satan's essential counterbalance, the pragmatic strategist to Satan's visionary rebel. When Satan's rhetoric becomes too heated, too impulsive, Beelzebub tempers it with measured counsel. He asks the crucial questions, considers consequences, thinks several moves ahead. If Satan is the inspirational leader who rallies troops with passionate speeches, Beelzebub is the chief of staff who ensures those passions translate into effective action. This dynamic becomes most apparent in Book 2. During the Great Demonic Council in Pandemonium, various fallen angels propose different strategies for opposing God. Moloch advocates direct warfare. Mammon suggests building their own kingdom in hell. Belial counsels passive endurance. The debate grows heated, positions harden, and unity threatens to fracture. Then, Beelzebub rises to speak. His proposal is elegant in its cunning. Rather than attacking heaven directly, or accepting their fate, why not corrupt God's newly created humanity? This strategy offers revenge without direct confrontation, victory through proxy warfare. More significantly, it reframes their defeat, not as final, but as a temporary setback, before a new campaign on a different battlefield. Beelzebub doesn't just propose a plan. He provides the fallen angels with renewed purpose and direction. Milton characterizes Beelzebub as a measured, persuasive speaker, whose rhetoric often tempers Satan's more impulsive ambitions. This isn't the mindless corruption of a beast, but the calculated manipulation of a master tactician. Beelzebub understands psychology, politics, and strategy. He knows when to speak and when to remain silent, when to advocate boldly, and when to defer to Satan's authority. His intelligence makes him far more dangerous than any number of lesser demons motivated by simple malice. Literary critics have debated Beelzebub's motivations extensively. Some see him as driven by envy, forever in Satan's shadow, using his intelligence to maintain relevance in an infernal court where Satan's charisma dominates. Others interpret him as genuinely loyal, Satan's truest companion, who stayed faithful even in their darkest hour. Still others suggest he represents the bureaucratic evil of those who facilitate atrocity through administrative efficiency rather than passionate hatred. What makes Milton's Beelzebub particularly chilling is his reasonableness. He doesn't rant or rage, he analyzes and proposes. He treats the corruption of humanity not as emotional revenge but as practical necessity. This cold rationality makes him a precursor to Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, the idea that great atrocities often stem not from monsters, but from ordinary people making calculated decisions without grappling with their moral weight. The proposal to corrupt humanity rather than confront God directly also reveals Beelzebub's understanding of asymmetric warfare. Hell cannot match heaven's power in direct combat. That much has been proven, but indirect approaches, subversion rather than confrontation, might succeed where force failed. This strategic insight transforms the cosmic conflict from a simple good versus evil binary into something more complex, a war of competing strategies, of moves and countermoves, where psychological manipulation might prove more effective than supernatural force. While Milton gave Beelzebub literary complexity, medieval grimoires and demonological texts provided the institutional framework of his power. Chief among these authorities was Johann Weyer, a 16th-century physician and occultist whose accounts shaped European understanding of demonic hierarchies. According to Weyer, Beelzebub accomplished something remarkable. He led a successful revolt against Satan himself. This detail, largely absent from earlier traditions, suggested a complex political situation in hell with factions, shifting alliances, and power struggles. Beelzebub wasn't merely Satan's lieutenant, but potentially his rival, someone who had challenged the established order and won concessions. The result of this revolt was Beelzebub's appointment as chief lieutenant of Lucifer, the emperor of hell, and his establishment as leader of the Order of the Fly. This order wasn't a random collection of demons, but a formal institution, a hierarchical organization modeled on medieval military and religious orders. The Knights Templar had their white mantles with red crosses. The Order of the Golden Fleece had its elaborate regalia. Beelzebub's order had flies. The symbolism ran deeper than mere association with filth. Flies represented several theologically significant concepts that medieval demonologists would have recognized immediately. First, persistence. Flies return no matter how many times you swat them away, just as demonic temptation never truly ceases. Second, ubiquity. Flies appear everywhere, in palaces and hovels alike, suggesting that no social class or sacred space was immune to corruption. Third, consumption. Flies exist to consume and decompose, breaking down what was once vital and alive into decay. The Dictionnaire Infernal, published in 1818 by Jacques Collin de Plancy, expanded on this imagery with detailed descriptions and illustrations. It depicted Beelzebub as a being capable of flying, known as the Lord of the Flies, Lord of the Flyers, or the Lord of the Flying Demons. The repetition of flying emphasized not just the physical act, but the symbolic freedom of demonic forces to move unchecked through the world. Medieval accounts of demonic possession frequently mentioned Beelzebub by name. In the famous case of Sister Madeleine de Demondol de la Palude, in Aix-en-Provence in 1611, the possessed nun named Beelzebub as one of her tormentors. Her exorcism became a public spectacle, and one account claimed that during the ritual, Beelzebub emerged from her mouth as a fly, visible to all witnesses. The French occultist Pierre Leloyer recorded this testimony, giving it scholarly credence that influenced subsequent possession cases. This incident encapsulated the medieval understanding of Beelzebub's nature. He could manifest physically as a fly, he could possess humans, and he required formal exorcism to expel. The fly wasn't merely symbolic but actual, a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption. The boundary between metaphor and reality dissolved in these accounts, creating a theology where Beelzebub existed simultaneously as abstract principle and material being. The persistence of fly imagery in Beelzebub's portrayal also connected to ancient understanding of disease and contagion. Before germ theory, people recognized that flies spread sickness without understanding the mechanism. Flies on wounds caused infection. Flies on food caused illness. Flies swarming on the dead presaged plague. Beelzebub as Lord of Flies thus embodied not just moral corruption but physical disease, the degradation of both body and soul. Modern psychology and literature have found in Beelzebub a powerful symbol for exploring human nature's darker dimensions. The connection between Beelzebub and gluttony, initially established by Peter Binsfeld in 1589, has proven remarkably durable precisely because it captures something essential about compulsive consumption that transcends historical periods. Gluttony, in contemporary understanding, extends far beyond overeating. It encompasses any insatiable appetite, for food certainly, but also for wealth, power, pleasure, attention, or validation. The glutton cannot be satisfied because the hunger isn't physical, but spiritual. No amount of consumption fills the void, because the void isn't in the stomach, but in the soul. This psychological insight illuminates why Binsfeld paired Beelzebub specifically with gluttony, rather than with the superficially more impressive sins of pride or wrath. Gluttony represents the reduction of human consciousness to pure appetite, the transformation of a person into a consuming mechanism. The individual becomes, in essence, a fly, driven by instinctive compulsion rather than rational choice or moral consideration. William Golding understood this symbolism profoundly when he titled his 1954 novel, Lord of the Flies. The pig's head on a stick, swarming with flies, becomes Beelzebub's literal manifestation in the story. But Golding wasn't interested in Christian demonology. He was exploring how quickly civilization's veneer cracks when social structures collapse. The boys on the island don't encounter an external demon. They discover the demon within themselves, the capacity for savage violence masked by proper English manners. Simon's hallucinatory conversation with the Lord of the Flies serves as the novel's moral center. The severed pig's head tells Simon, "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. This revelation echoes Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the unconscious aspects of personality that the conscious ego doesn't identify with. Beelzebub, in this reading, represents the shadow self, the primitive appetites and violent impulses that civilization attempts to suppress but never truly eliminates. The flies themselves function as a bridge between the physical and psychological. They're attracted to the decaying pig's head, just as humanity's baser instincts are attracted to violence and domination. They swarm and buzz, creating chaos and discomfort, just as unexamined impulses create psychological disturbance. They consume and corrupt, transforming what was once vital into putrefaction, just as unchecked appetites transform human dignity into degradation. In consumer culture, the psychological dimension of Beelzebub's gluttony has taken on new relevance. We live in an economy built on the premise that satisfaction is always just one more purchase away. Marketing creates desire for products we didn't know existed, suggesting that acquisition will fill whatever void we feel. But the satisfaction proves temporary. Soon we need the next product, the upgraded version, the latest model. We become flies buzzing around the marketplace, consuming endlessly yet never sated. The environmental consequences of this collective gluttony are becoming impossible to ignore. Humanity consumes resources at rates that exceed planetary renewal, dumps waste that poisons ecosystems, and treats the Earth itself as an infinite source for insatiable appetite. From this perspective, contemporary civilization might be understood as collectively possessed by Beelzebub, driven by compulsive consumption that even its participants recognize as ultimately destructive, but feel powerless to stop. Yet there's also a redemptive possibility in recognizing Beelzebub's nature. If gluttony stems from spiritual emptiness rather than physical need, then the solution isn't more consumption, but addressing the underlying void. Various religious and philosophical traditions offer paths, mindfulness practices that create awareness of when needs are genuinely satisfied, spiritual disciplines that provide meaning beyond material accumulation, community bonds that offer belonging rather than individual acquisition, the recognition that we're dealing with a spiritual problem rather than simply a failure of willpower opens possibilities for healing that transcend mere restraint. Beelzebub, understood psychologically, becomes a mirror showing us our own insatiable hungers. The demon isn't out there but in here, in the restlessness that drives endless scrolling through social media, the compulsion to check email one more time, the inability to sit quietly without distraction. We're all potentially flies, buzzing from stimulus to stimulus, consuming attention and experiences without genuine engagement, mistaking activity for meaning. From Philistine temple to medieval grimoire to psychological archetype, Beelzebub's journey spans millennia and transforms with each cultural context. Yet, certain elements persist: the association with flies and decay, the position of terrible authority, second only to ultimate evil, and the connection to insatiable appetite that consumes without satisfaction. What makes Beelzebub particularly relevant to contemporary consciousness is precisely this connection between ancient demonology and modern psychology. We may not believe in literal demons anymore, but we recognize the reality of compulsive consumption, of appetites that grow stronger with feeding, of the reduction of human dignity to mere craving. Beelzebub names something we experience but struggle to articulate: the sense that we've become what we consume, that our identities have dissolved into our appetites. The medieval demonologists, for all their literal belief in physical demons, understood something profound. Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It arrives wearing the face of satisfaction, promising fulfillment just beyond the next acquisition, the next indulgence, the next distraction. Beelzebub doesn't drag souls to hell through violence. They follow him willingly, chasing insatisfaction that retreats with every step toward it. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the Lord of Flies. The most effective corruption isn't forced but chosen. Gluttony, unlike wrath or pride, doesn't proclaim itself boldly. It whispers that you deserve one more, that satisfaction is achievable, that the emptiness can be filled if you just consume a little more. And we listen because the alternative, confronting the void directly, accepting that some hungers can't be fed, requires a courage we're not sure we possess. If you found this exploration of Beelzebub's transformation from ancient deity to embodiment of insatiable appetite compelling, consider subscribing to History Scrolls for more deep dives into mythology and demonology. Like this video if you learned something new about how theological evolution reflects changing human anxieties across centuries. And share your thoughts in the comments. Which interpretation of Beelzebub resonates most with you? The strategic demon of Milton's epic, the psychological symbol of modern literature, or the medieval tempter of gluttony? The conversation continues beyond this video. In the eternal human struggle with appetite, consumption, and the search for satisfaction that lies beyond mere accumulation.